Millionaire single dad pretends to be broke on every blind date until he meets a waitress who fills his coffee without being asked. Before we begin the story, don't forget to follow Tender Bonds, like and share our story. Sila's drum drove a truck with one working headlight for 11 months, and nobody told him because nobody was paying that kind of attention to him anymore. This is what happened. His best friend Miller Greer died of pancreatic cancer in September, and Miller had two daughters, Cass, 11, and Joni, 8, and no living family beyond a sister in Phoenix who sent Christmas cards with money in them and nothing else. So Silas took the girls. He did this because Miller had asked him to once near the end, in a hospital room in Mansfield that smelled like industrial lemon and the particular exhaustion of time being used up. Miller had said you'd do it the way he said most things, straight and without theater, like they were discussing a section of fence that needed replacing. Yeah, Silas had said. You don't have to want to. I know. What Silas had not told Miller because he hadn't known it yet himself was that he did want to. Not in any way he could have named, but the wanting was in him somewhere, small and unexamined, the way water is in stone. He had money. This is the other relevant fact, and it sat in the background of his life, the way the grain elevator sat at the edge of Crestline. Large, structural, not something you looked at directly unless you had a reason. His grandfather had bought farmland in 3 counties in 1961, and the land had been left alone, and the money from it had been left alone, and Silas had added to it through a decade of commodity trading. He'd done quietly, from a laptop in the kitchen, before the girls came, and the kitchen became a place for permission slips, and a rooster-shaped salt shaker that had belonged to Miller's mother, and had no business existing in any century. He was not flashy about it. He had never been flashy about it. After Miller died, he became even less so, not as concealment but as genuine indifference, the way a man stops caring about his reflection when he is very tired. But Connie Pellegrino, the school's parent coordinator, who had decided that Silas's problem was loneliness and that loneliness was a problem with a solution, had apparently mentioned him to someone who had mentioned him to someone else. By December, he had been on 3 blind dates, and each one had included in the first 30 minutes a version of the same question. And what is it you do, exactly? That was not really a question. So he made a decision. The Carhartt jacket, the boots that needed resoling, the truck, cash for everything, second cheapest item on the menu, no talk about the farmland or the trading or the inheritance. He wanted to see. He told himself this while standing in the bathroom mirror one December morning. Whether there was a woman in Crawford County capable of looking at what he actually was, worn down and half-operational and raising 2 girls who weren't biologically his, and finding something worth staying for. He did not call any of them back. The fields between Bucyrus and Crestline in February were the color of old concrete. The sky above them was the same color as the fields. The truck's single working headlight threw a cone of yellow into the dark on his nightly drives between the house and nowhere. Just driving, just keeping the heat going. The way you keep a pilot light lit in a house you're not sure you're coming back to. He had Miller's toolbox in the garage. It was a Craftsman, the old kind, brick red paint gone to oxidized rust, latches gone green, 60 pounds empty. Miller had kept it the way he kept everything. Sockets in size order, tape on the crescent wrench where the grip had cracked in 2007, a wooden-handled screwdriver older than either of them. Silas had carried it from Miller's truck the day after the funeral and set it on the workbench and hadn't opened it until the pipe. The restaurant was called Halford's, and it sat on a county road east of Bucyrus that smelled like diesel from the grain trucks even in hard winter. It had a lunch counter and 8 tables, and a pie case that rotated slowly under fluorescent light. Silas had been eating there on Thursdays for 6 weeks before he understood why. It smelled like the grain elevator. It smelled like Miller's work clothes at supper. The waitress's name was Trace. White plastic pin, black letters, the kind reused until the surface went soft. She had brown hair pulled back without ceremony and moved through the narrow space between counter and kitchen with the economy of someone who had learned to take up exactly the room she needed. She poured his coffee without asking. Not the first time she'd asked, but by the third Thursday she came over with the pot and filled his mug before he'd settled his jacket on the stool, not making it a question or a gesture, just doing it because she'd noticed he always wanted it, and noticing things was part of how she moved through the world. It was not intimacy. It was attention. He wasn't sure he'd ever felt the distinction so clearly before. He ordered the open-faced turkey on the fourth Thursday, third cheapest. He didn't think about that until he was in the truck. Connie tried again in January. The woman's name was Tracy, with an I, who sold insurance. He dressed the same, Carhartt boots, cash. She looked at the jacket with the polite, calibrating expression he'd learned to recognize, the one where a woman is trying to reconcile what she's been told with what's sitting across from her in a diner booth. He didn't help her with it. He ate his meal and tipped 20% and drove home on the bypass in the dark with the single headlight. He did not call Tracy back. In late January, Connie called again. Her name is April, Connie said. She's grounded. She is a genuinely grounded person. Okay, he said. She's not going to care about, you know. Okay, Connie. He took April to a diner in Galleon. She was pleasant. She asked about the girls, which he appreciated, and about his work, which he answered carefully, farming, which was true as far as it went. She was looking at the jacket again, at the boots. He watched the calculation complete itself behind her eyes. This is not what I was told, and he sat with it, let her work it out, and she was gracious enough not to say anything, and he respected her for that. When she asked, over coffee, whether he owned the land or just worked it, he said he owned some, which was accurate in the way that calling the Pacific Ocean some water was accurate. She didn't call him, he didn't call her. He drove home on the county road and thought, for the first time he'd let himself, about Trace, the coffee, the not tasking. He counted how many times she'd appeared in his thoughts that week and understood, with some alarm, that he'd been counting at all. The pipe went at 2:17 in the morning in the third week of February. Not a clean burst, a sustained failure under the kitchen, a sound like the house deciding something structural about itself. He came downstairs in his socks and stepped into 2 inches of cold water before the situation announced itself fully. He got the girls up. Cass came down practical, already in her boots, which was Miller's precision living in her. Joni came down crying, and he didn't tell her not to. He gave her the flashlight to hold. She held it in both hands, face still wet, and the steadiness of her grip, 8 years old in the middle of the night in a flooded kitchen, moved through him like current through a wire, not stopping anywhere, just moving. He called the plumber, Bud Hesser from the hardware store, who came at 3 a.m. without complaint, the way good tradespeople do in small towns. While Bud worked, Sela's got the girls onto the kitchen table with their feet up and made hot chocolate on the camp stove he kept in the garage. And Cass said, in a voice working hard to be joking, "Are we ruined?" "No," he said. "Is the house ruined?" "No." "Are you ruined?" He looked at her across the camp stove's blue flame. "I don't think so," he said. Bud was there until 6. The water went away. The damage was 2 sections of copper that had gone thin with age. He'd need a proper plumber back in the spring, which would cost real money, which he had, which he would simply spend without drama. He paid Bud in cash. The girls went back to bed. He changed his socks and sat alone at the kitchen table in the early gray light, and there was for 10 minutes nothing in him at all. Not grief, not relief, not anything with a name, just the silence of a house that had been tested and held. Then he went to the garage. He pulled the chain on the workbench light and stood there a moment before he opened Miller's toolbox. He'd been in it twice since September, once for the crescent wrench, once on general desperate principle, and both times he'd moved things slightly, disrupted the size order sockets, left the wooden screwdriver at the wrong angle. He stood looking at what Miller had built in their over 20 years of deliberate organization. He took out the crescent wrench, peeled the old electrical tape carefully. It came off in one piece, keeping the ghost of Miller's grip, and found a fresh roll in the drawer and wrapped the handle again tight, the way Miller had done it. Put it back. Took out the wooden screwdriver and put it in the coffee can with his own tools, where he'd reach for it without thinking. Moved some of the sockets, not disordering them, just making room, redistributing them into a logic that was neither entirely Miller's nor entirely his own. He closed the lid. He turned off the light. In March, when the ice on the county roads began admitting defeat, Connie called with a nurse from Mansfield named Wendy. He said yes. He always said yes. It was easier than the conversation about why he was saying no. And this time, without deciding to, he drove past Galleon and past the Bucyrus turnoff and pulled into Halford's parking lot. Wendy was already inside. She was direct and warm and spoke about her two boys with the compressed, efficient love of a person who has stopped performing parenthood and just does it. He liked her immediately and felt the distance between himself, and that liking like a measurement he couldn't close. Trace poured his coffee without asking, started for Wendy's cup. "Tea, please," Wendy said, "if you have it." On her way back with the tea, Trace passed him the dish towel from one hand to the other, wiping condensation from a glass nearby, and met his eyes for exactly the length of time that takes. No more. He and Wendy had dinner for 90 minutes. She was a good woman. In the parking lot after, under the Halford sign with its dark she looked at him with the frankness of someone who has done enough of this to read it accurately. "You're somewhere else," she said. "I'm sorry." "Don't be, I know the look." She smiled, and it was not unkind. "Whoever she is, you should do something about it." He stood in the parking lot after her taillights disappeared. The air had that March quality, still cold but with something behind it, a suggestion of intention. He thought about Miller standing in the parking lot of the grain elevator at day's end, just standing there, not ready to get in the truck. Miller had never explained that, and Silas had never asked. He came back on a Saturday. He dropped the girls at Connie's, which caused Connie to go silent in a way that expressed a great deal, and he drove to Halford's and sat at the counter at 9 a.m. with his hands flat on the formica. Trace came out of the kitchen. She saw him, and something arranged itself neutrally in her face. "Saturday," she said. "Yeah." She poured the coffee. She leaned against her side of the counter, which she didn't usually do. "You brought someone here," she said. "I did." "Bad date." She was good, it was bad. Trace picked up a rag and wiped a section of counter that didn't need it. "I've done that," she said. "Brought someone somewhere that was mine. Regretted it." He hadn't known he'd done that until she named it. "I come here because it smells like grain," he said. "Like the elevator. Miller worked there." She stopped wiping. "He died," Silas said. "Pancreatic, September. He had 2 girls and no one else, so I took them." She put the rag down. "That's not something people do." "He was my friend." Still. The door opened and let in March air, cold but no longer January cold, carrying something behind it like a question that hadn't been asked yet. Trace went to clear a table and came back. "I have a daughter," she said. "Me, she's 6. Her dad's in Columbus." She said it without performance, just load-bearing facts stated plainly. "I work the early shift 3 days so I can get her from school. Halford lets me." "How do you do it?" he said. She looked at him. "How do you?" The pie case rotated. A grain truck went by outside and the windows shook slightly, and the fluorescent light above the case flickered once. "You should bring them sometime," she said. "Saturdays are slow, we have good pie." He looked at his coffee. "Joni likes blueberry. Cass says she doesn't like pie." Trace put the rag over her shoulder. "I made a child who didn't like pie try it 3 Saturdays in a row. Fourth Saturday, she asked for seconds. He left a tip that was larger than usual but not absurd. He stopped himself from absurd and drove home on the county road. When he got back, he looked up the number for the only proper plumber in Bucyrus, the one who did good work and charged accordingly, and he booked him for the spring repairs and paid the deposit over the phone without discussing it. Then he looked up Halford's. It had a website, barely, a JPEG of the menu and a phone number. He'd known for weeks that the pie case's rotating mechanism was grinding, that one of the fluorescent tubes behind it flickered, that the booth nearest the window had a crack running the length of the bench seat. He had a way of cataloging structural needs without meaning to. He found the owner's contact, a man named Gerald Halford in Bucyrus, and sent an email that was brief and businesslike. "I'd like to make an anonymous improvement to your property. Please let me know the best way to facilitate this." He sent it before he could think too carefully about what it meant that he was doing it. He had the reply by morning. He brought the girls the following Saturday. Joni got there first and stood inside the door and looked at the pie case. It was a new mechanism now, turning smoothly, the flickering tube replaced, the whole thing lit up cleanly, and her face went still and opened the way it did when she was watching something closely. The stillness was Miller's. It was also just Joni. Trace's daughter Mee was at the counter with a coloring book. She and Joni regarded each other with the frank assessment of children, and then Joni climbed onto the stool next to her, and that was that. Cass came in last, took in the situation at a glance, sat at the end of the counter with her homework. Trace brought coffee without being asked, set hot chocolate in front of Joni and me. Cass looked up and said, pointing at the pie case, "What kind is that one?" "Apple and buttermilk today," Trace said. "I don't really like pie," Cass said. "I'll bring you a sliver of the apple." She walked away before Cass could contest it. He sat at the counter and the diner moved around him, the pie case turning clean and steady, the highway out the window, me showing Joni a page in the coloring book, Cass eating the apple pie one careful forkful at a time with the studied neutrality of a child refusing to be wrong. He did not think about the money he'd sent to Gerald Halford. He thought about it the way you think about a right thing, briefly, then not at all. Trace came to refill his cup and glanced at the case without comment, and he understood that she didn't know and wouldn't, and he wasn't going to tell her. She looked over and caught him watching. He didn't look away. She didn't either. Then Joni said something that made me laugh, and Trace moved to the far end of the counter, and Cass said, without looking up from her fork, "This is pretty good, actually." "Yeah," he said. "Don't tell Connie." "She already knows," he said. "She knows everything." Cass almost smiled. That was enough. He went to the garage that night after the girls were in bed. The pull-chain light, the workbench, Miller's toolbox sitting where it had sat since September. He opened it. He spent a long time looking at what was inside, the sockets that were partly his arrangement now and partly Miller's, the crescent wrench with its new tape sitting in its old groove, the wooden screwdriver that had been in the coffee can for 3 weeks and was already getting used without his thinking about it. He took the toolbox off the workbench, set it on the shelf below, down where he kept the things he used regularly, and made room for it among his own, reorganized the shelf so it fit. He turned off the light. The porch light was on when he came back inside. He'd been leaving it on since October, no particular reason, just a habit that had started when the girls came and never stopped. He stood at the door and looked out through the glass at what it did, threw a cone of yellow over the steps, out onto the walk, reaching into the dark yard, further than it needed to. Tomorrow he would call Trace. He had the restaurant's number. He would use it to ask her, plainly and without architecture, whether she wanted to have dinner, and she would say yes or she would say she needed to think about it, and either answer would be a true one and he could work with true. But that was tomorrow. He stood at the door and looked at the light on the steps. The March night outside was cold still, but the kind of cold that knows something's coming. The fields around Crestline would be reading it right now in the dark, the frost beginning to let go of things, and in a few weeks the color would start coming back. That tentative, almost embarrassed green, and the grain trucks would be back on the county road, and the elevator would be running, and the air would smell the way it did when Miller was alive. He stood there and breathed it. Just stood there,